welcome to Eye on Africa. I'm Clarisse Fortuné. Our top stories. A death toll on the rise in Nigeria. Nearly 200 villagers were killed last weekend in a series of attacks across Plateau State. Several people wounded in DRC in a banned protest. 5 candidates are calling for a rerun of last week's national elections. And what happened this year in the world of technology on the continent? Our special year in review for 2023 continues. The death toll has now climbed to almost 200 people after a series of attacks on villages in central Nigeria. The majority was killed in Bokos in Plateau State last weekend. President Bola Ahmed Tinubu have condemned the killings. Meanwhile, survivors have begun to bury the dead. Clémence Valère.
It's a community in mourning. On Tuesday, the villagers of Mayanga in central Nigeria held a mass funeral for their loved ones who were killed during attacks across the Plateau State.
There are many people that were killed, slaughtered like animals. They are cold-blooded. Some are in their house, some were even outside. Today, we buried about 150 all over in the zone.
Local officials say military gangs launched attacks in not fewer than 20 different communities across the region. The death toll is likely to rise, with more than 500 people injured and several missing. According to the commander for the Nigerian army in the Plateau State, security services were caught unawares.
I thought we had been able to understand each other and we have achieved peace on the plateau. We have started receiving commendations. But the devil's work that happened on the eve of Christmas cannot be explained because it is unprovoked. We were overwhelmed.
Northwest and central Nigeria have long been the scenes of violence linked to bandit militias and jihadist conflict. Tensions have also flared between nomadic herders and farmers over competition for natural resources, intensified by rapid population growth and climate pressures. After the Plateau State governor condemned last weekend's tragedy, his office vowed to take proactive steps to curb attacks on civilians.
Now to DRC. 1 week after the elections took place, clashes broke out today during a banned protest organized by the opposition. Martin Fayulu and 4 other candidates are calling for the rerun of the general elections. Maya Yatagene has more.
Demonstrators throwing stones at police officers, receiving tear gas and rubber bullets in return. Several people were wounded as authorities dispersed the protest held at the headquarters of Martin Fayulu, one of the 5 opposition leaders who called on their supporters to march against last week's election. A vote, they say, that was marred by several irregularities.
Nous avons dit que nous allons manifester.
We said we'd protest to say no to this electoral robbery, no to this sham of an election. I've been telling you for a long time that Mr. Kadima, expert in election monitoring, was preparing chaos. And here we are.
The initial plan was to march to the office of the National Election Commission, but the government banned the protest on Tuesday, saying it had no legal basis and was aimed at undermining the electoral process. Police claimed to have seen minors among the demonstrators and that the organizers of the march would be summoned for questioning.
Some police officers were injured by stone throwing, and a few minors were injured by stone throwing by intruders, which is exactly what we feared.
Some rights groups and international observers have also questioned the vote, saying it was illegally extended. Final results are expected before the turn of the year.
And in other news, in brief, at least 15 people died in a tanker truck accident. The vehicle carrying gasoline exploded after a crash along a road in Totota in Bong County. Police says at least 30 more people were injured. As locals gathered at the scene at the moment of the explosion, people were trying to get free gas from the tank. Still no sign of Burkina Faso former foreign minister, now opposition leader Ablassé Ouedraogo, has been missing for 3 days after being taken away by people who said they were from the police. His party, Faso Autrement, says it doesn't know where he is and is calling for his immediate release without conditions. Ablase Ouedraogo has been critical of the military regime that's been ruling Burkina Faso since a coup late 2022. Elections in Senegal are due to take place on February 2024, and 79 people have filed their candidacy for the top job, according to a local newspaper. Among the main favorites, Amadou Ba, current Prime Minister, imprisoned opposition figure Ousmane Sonko, and former Dakar Mayor Khalifa Sall. In Idrissa Seck, current president since 2012, Macky Sall is not seeking another term. As we're getting ready to say goodbye to 2023, we continue our year in review, looking back at major events on the continent and beyond. Today, our focus is the world of science and technology. I'm joined now by Tony Tiyu. He's the CEO of Renewables in Africa. Tony, welcome, and let's start straight away with the latest big event, COP28. Leaders agreed on a transition away from fossil fuels. So, what does it mean for the continent, especially for the countries producing fuels like Nigeria, for example?
That's a very good question, and thank you for asking me the question. And COP28 has just finished, and one of the main issue was, or the main actual outcome was the transition away from fossil fuel. And this is actually quite interesting, but also challenging for Africa. And you mentioned about Nigeria, because it's one of the countries that rely heavily on oil and gas revenue, right? You need to know, for example, that Nigeria, they're taking 10% of the revenue from oil and gas, and also it represents 80% of the export, which is $30 billion, right, revenue. So getting rid of that will not be easy. Yeah, the same thing as well for Angola, right, rely as well heavily on oil and gas. So how could those countries manage the economic impact while accelerating the investment to renewable is something that will be seen. And I believe that's one of the challenges that the country will be going for, but definitely lots of opportunities.
So what about alternative? We know that African countries are not the biggest emitter, but some are making the biggest efforts. So what countries, can you give us some examples, and what other solutions have you found?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, right? Because I can single out a country like Kenya, right? So they've been making significant progress in terms of renewables. You need to know, for example, 90% of their electricity is coming from sources like geothermal, solar, wind. And also Kenya, interestingly, so this year they organized the first Africa Climate Summit, right? That was early, I think it was in September, right? Where they brought together policymakers, but also sustainability leaders to look at how can the continent embrace energy transition. And one of the key outcomes that I can talk about is the Nairobi Declaration on Climate Change, which was signed by more than 30 countries in Africa, which is really committing Africa to pursue renewables energy and also to commit as well to energy transition and mobilizing more than $25 billion investment over the next 5 years. So that is very interesting. So yes, so Kenya has been doing well, but I can also mention Ethiopia doing a lot of effort, but also Namibia pushing with green hydrogen. So yes, there's some countries definitely making step forwards.
So what else happened in the world of innovation on the continent? We have some big brains on the continent.
Thank you for asking me this question. So I want to talk about three things, if you allow me to talk about it, right? So I want to talk about, for example, the growth of African startup. So what is quite interesting is that in 2021, we've seen a record investment of more than $5 billion in African startup, right? And in 2022, just for the first 9 months, we already reached that figure. So definitely the total figure for 2022 is higher. And among those investments, so it actually gone through more than 12 startups that now are valued at more than $1 billion. It means that there is a strong interest for Africa, you know, whether you're talking about startup in fintech, digital payment, and also energy tech, you know, like, for example, Energy, who is bringing solar to businesses. There's a lot we can talk about. And the second point I want to talk about here, it's obviously the launch of Africa Green Hydrogen Alliances. That was one of the key highlights of COP27 in Egypt, if you remember. So what it does, very simple. So take into account the large resource of renewable energy that the continent has and focusing that into producing green hydrogen at scale. So that's the key word here. And you have countries like Namibia, South Africa, Algeria joining that. That was great. And finally, I want to talk about a startup that is based in France, which is actually led by African diaspora, which is called Renew Tech, which is actually showing that the continent can also be leading pioneering companies that are actually moving towards hydrogen. And what they're doing, they're actually producing fuel cells with hydrogen that's allowing faster adoption by buses, maritime applications, and those systems are actually more effective, they're versatile, but they're also cost effective and highly efficient. So definitely, it's a company you want to look at. Renew Tech, that's how they call.
But Tony, we've also been talking a lot about artificial intelligence. So is the continent also surfing on this trend?
Well, continent can't be immune to artificial intelligence, isn't it, right? So everybody now is talking about it. Obviously, you will see the same as well for Africa. But it's also fair to say that the enthusiasm is a little bit more reduced because it's also linked to how fast you have the coverage of internet in the continent. Having said that, in banking, for example, you have some larger players that are utilizing our AI to have some automated credit risk that they will look at for people that are looking to borrow money. So you have, for example, startup lenders like Fair Money. They are processing more than 1 million monthly loan applications using intelligent algorithm. And you also have other companies that are doing that. For example, in Rwanda, you have Bebel. They're using AI analytics to look at patient data to augment doctor diagnostics. So yes, artificial intelligence is making good progress, albeit slightly slower compared to the rest of the world.
Well, Tony, to you, thank you from Renewable Energy. Thank you very much for your look around 2023. Well, that's how we end this edition. Thank you for watching Eye on Africa. More news to follow.